Have you ever noticed that the most dangerous moments in history rarely begin with visible chaos? They begin with calm. Not the calm that comes from true peace, but the kind that makes people lower their guard. The kind that whispers, "Everything is finally getting better." And according to biblical prophecy, that exact moment may be one of the most dangerous signs humanity could ever witness. Because the Bible describes a time when the world will feel like it is stabilizing. Conflicts will appear to cool down, economies may seem to recover, diplomatic agreements could create the illusion that mankind has finally found the formula for coexistence. Leaders will speak about unity. News headlines will begin using one word over and over again: peace. And that is precisely when Scripture tells us to be most alert. Not later. Not when the sky is already falling. Not when the systems are visibly collapsing. But before, long before. When everything looks deceptively normal. And what makes this warning so unsettling is that it is not hidden in obscure passages. It is written with disturbing clarity. 1 Thessalonians 5:3 says, "For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them." Notice the order. First comes the declaration, peace and safety. Then comes sudden destruction. Not gradual decline, not a slow unraveling, sudden, unexpected, like a trap snapping shut. And here is what most people miss. Biblical prophecy never says the world collapses while everyone is panicking. It says collapse arrives while people are reassured, while they are convinced the worst is behind them. That is what makes this prophecy so psychologically powerful. Human beings are not usually destroyed by what they fear. They are often destroyed by what they wrongly trust. And right now, that may be the greatest vulnerability of this generation. Because after years of instability, crisis, division, wars, inflation, social unrest, and global uncertainty, humanity is desperate for relief. Desperate people are highly susceptible to false solutions. They don't just want peace, they crave it. And when people crave something deeply enough, they often stop asking the hard questions. Who is offering this peace? At what cost? What must be surrendered in exchange? And most importantly, is this true peace or merely engineered stability? Because the Bible distinguishes between the two. Real peace is rooted in truth. False peace is built on appearance. It looks convincing. It feels comforting. But underneath, structural decay continues spreading, like a building with a beautiful exterior and a collapsing foundation. And by the time the cracks become visible, it is already too late. But this pattern is not new. It has happened before, again and again. Before judgment in the days of Noah, life appeared ordinary. People were eating, drinking, marrying, planning futures, building routines. Nothing outwardly suggested that civilization was about to be interrupted, until it was. Matthew 24:38-39 says, "For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, and knew not until the flood came." Did you catch that? They knew not. Not because warnings were absent, but because normalcy anesthetized urgency. This is one of the enemy's oldest strategies, not always terror. Sometimes distraction, sometimes comfort, sometimes the illusion that everything is under control. And this is where the warning becomes deeply personal. Because prophecy is not merely about geopolitical systems, it is also about spiritual posture. A false sense of peace can exist in nations, but it can also exist inside individuals. A person can be spiritually asleep while feeling emotionally calm. They can feel secure while drifting further from discernment. This is why Jesus repeatedly used one command when speaking about the end times. Watch, stay awake, remain alert. Not terrified, alert. Because spiritual sleep rarely feels dangerous. It feels comfortable. That is why it is so effective. No one intentionally chooses deception. They simply stop paying attention. And little by little, sensitivity declines, convictions weaken, discernment dulls, compromise becomes easier. What once felt alarming begins to feel normal. And eventually, people adapt to conditions they once would have resisted. That is how large shifts happen, not overnight, but through gradual normalization, until one day the line has moved so far that people no longer remember where it originally stood. And then comes the sudden turn. This is exactly what makes biblical warnings so urgent. The danger is rarely announced in obvious terms. It is hidden inside progress narratives, inside comforting language, inside promises of unity detached from truth. Because peace without truth is rarely sustainable. It is often temporary suppression, a lid placed over deeper instability, pressure building beneath the surface. And pressure always seeks release. History confirms this repeatedly. Periods of apparent stability are often followed by major disruption. Not because peace itself is dangerous, but because false peace delays preparation. It convinces people that preparation is unnecessary, and unprepared systems are fragile, unprepared minds are vulnerable, unprepared hearts are easily shaken, which leads to the next critical question. If a false peace precedes sudden collapse, how should believers respond? Not with paranoia, not with obsession, and certainly not with fear-driven speculation. Scripture never rewards panic. It rewards preparedness. There is a profound difference. Panic is reactive. Preparedness is intentional. Panic scatters focus. Preparedness sharpens it. And one of the clearest biblical instructions for such times is found in Luke 21:34. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down. Weighed down by what? Not only sin, not only fear, but also the distractions of life. In other words, spiritual dullness is not always caused by rebellion. Sometimes it is caused by overload, mental exhaustion, endless consumption, noise, distraction, constant stimulation. A mind constantly flooded is often a mind less capable of discernment. And perhaps that is one of the greatest challenges of modern life. Not lack of information, but excess of it. Too much noise can function like blindness. When everything demands attention, meaningful signals become harder to detect. And this is why silence has become spiritually strategic. Stillness sharpens perception. Reflection restores pattern recognition. Prayer recalibrates internal alignment. Without those rhythms, people become highly externally driven. They respond to headlines, narratives, emotional waves, mass sentiment, instead of anchoring themselves in something deeper. And in times of manufactured reassurance, anchoring becomes essential. Because the world can shift faster than most people imagine. Systems people considered permanent can change quickly. Markets, governments, institutions, cultural norms, social structures. History is filled with examples of abrupt transitions. What felt stable wasn't, what felt permanent wasn't, and what people assumed could never happen, happened. That is why biblical wisdom consistently emphasizes where not to place ultimate trust, not in princes, not in systems, not in wealth, not in human guarantees, because all external structures are conditional. Only one foundation is described as unshakable, and this is where the message pivots from warning to invitation. Biblical prophecy is not designed merely to frighten. It is meant to awaken, to reposition, to clarify priorities, to expose misplaced confidence before circumstances do. That is mercy. A warning before impact is mercy. A signal before disruption is mercy. A map before the terrain changes is mercy. But warnings only help those willing to listen. And that is the dividing line. Not access to information, but response. What do you do once warned? Ignore? Delay? Assume there is more time. That assumption has undone many people, because humanity has a powerful tendency to postpone what feels spiritually important, but not immediately urgent. Tomorrow, later, eventually, when life slows down, when conditions improve, when it feels more convenient. But the problem with sudden events is built into the name. They are sudden. They do not request scheduling permission, and by the time urgency becomes obvious to everyone, flexibility often narrows dramatically. This is why Jesus told the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. Both groups expected the bridegroom. Both had some level of awareness, but only one group was prepared when delay ended. Preparation always seems excessive until the moment it becomes essential. That is a law far beyond prophecy. It is true in nearly every domain of life. The prepared often appear overly cautious right until reality validates them. And spiritual preparedness is no different. It may feel invisible, private, uncelebrated, but foundations are tested precisely when pressure intensifies, not before. So what does preparation look like now? It begins with clarity, reducing internal noise, returning to Scripture with seriousness, rebuilding disciplined prayer, strengthening discernment, examining where emotional security truly comes from. Because if peace is dependent entirely on external stability, then peace is fragile. But if peace is anchored deeper, external volatility loses some of its power. This is the paradox of biblical peace. It is not denial of turbulence, it is stability within turbulence. That kind of peace cannot be manufactured politically. It cannot be negotiated globally. It cannot be sustained through public messaging campaigns. It is internal before external, which means false peace and true peace can look similar from a distance, but produce entirely different outcomes. One collapses under pressure, the other remains. And that may be the defining separation of the coming years. Not merely who predicted events correctly, but who built on durable foundations. Because information alone does not create resilience, alignment does. A person can know many prophetic details and still be internally unstable. Knowledge without transformation is fragile. The goal is not merely to understand prophecy intellectually, it is to allow prophecy to shape how one lives now, how one prioritizes, how one prepares, how one perceives, how one remains steady when others are disoriented. And this is perhaps the deepest message hidden inside the warning. Collapse is not always the end of the story. For some, it is exposure. For others, it is refinement. The same shaking reveals different foundations. That is why two people can go through the same disruption and emerge completely differently. One collapses internally. The other becomes clearer, stronger, more anchored, more focused. Not because circumstances were easier, but because foundations were different. So perhaps the most important question is not whether the world is approaching a deceptive season of apparent peace. The more immediate question is this: what foundation are you standing on right now? Because when everything appears calm is precisely when foundations are easiest to ignore. No visible shaking means hidden weaknesses remain hidden, but hidden is not healed. And eventually conditions expose what comfort concealed. So do not confuse temporary calm with long-term security. Do not confuse collective reassurance with genuine stability. And do not assume visible normalcy means deeper conditions are healthy. The Bible warned about this long ago, not to create fear, but to create readiness. Because the most dangerous collapse is rarely the one people see coming. It is the one preceded by comfort, by reassurance, by confidence, by the collective belief that crisis has finally passed. And then everything changes. Suddenly, completely, irreversibly. Which is why this warning matters now more than ever. Stay awake, stay discerning, stay anchored. Because according to Scripture, sometimes the calm is not confirmation, sometimes the calm is the final signal. And what happens next changes everything. If this message challenged your perspective, stay for the next video, because the next prophecy may explain why these events are accelerating faster than most people realize.